Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into something pretty intriguing, the relationship between the Quran and the Bible.
Definitely intriguing. A lot more to it than some people might think.
We're going to really try to unpack what the Quran actually says about the Bible, not just, what people say it says.
Right, exactly. We're going straight to the source.
And I think some of what we find might surprise some listeners.
It's always more nuanced than you expect, right?
Totally. So to get us started, how about you give us a little rundown of how the Quran views these earlier scriptures, like the Bible?
Sure. So the Quran actually acknowledges several books that might sound pretty familiar. The Torah, Zabur, the Injil.
Okay, and it mentions itself.
Of course. It includes itself as the final revelation, naturally.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, for those of us who don't have those memorized, what are the, more common names for those first three?
Oh, right. So the Torah is known as the Torah, which makes up the Old Testament. Zabur refers to the Psalms, and the Injil is what Christians know as the New Testament, which centers around the Gospels.
Okay, so the Quran recognizes these texts.
It does.
But it views them through a very specific lens, am I right?
Exactly. It considers these earlier scriptures to be revelations from God, meant to guide humanity.
Right.
It places them within this whole lineage of divine communication, with the Quran being that final, most complete message.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting for me.
Oh, yeah.
Because the Quran explicitly tells Muslims to believe in these earlier scriptures, even though, like you said, it presents itself as this final word.
It's true. It's one of the more fascinating parts of how the Quran looks at it, and definitely something I think a lot of people miss.
Yeah.
It instructs Muslims to believe in all the scriptures that God revealed, and that includes the ones that came before it. Denying any of those scriptures, that's actually a serious no-no.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah.
It's like it's saying there's inherent value in these texts,
There is.
even if they come before the Quran.
Exactly. And that's where we get into this whole idea of textual integrity versus interpretation.
Okay, I'm following.
So, while the Quran's saying these earlier scriptures are super important, it also brings up some concerns about how they've been handled by some people.
You're talking about the idea of the Bible being corrupted.
Right, and that idea, we need to unpack that one carefully.
That's something you hear pretty often.
For sure, and it's important to be clear about what the Quran actually says directly versus what people have, kind of tacked onto it through interpretations over time.
Right, because the Quran never explicitly says that the actual text of the Bible itself has been, changed, right?
Exactly, never said that outright.
So what is it referring to then when it raises these concerns about the earlier scriptures?
It seems like it's more focused on how people have interpreted and taught these scriptures, even, and this is important, potentially manipulating them.
Manipulate them.
Yeah, for personal or political gain in some cases. Several verses in the Quran even directly criticize some people, specifically some groups within the Jewish and Christian traditions, for not upholding the real teachings of their scriptures.
So not following their own books.
Exactly, kind of picking and choosing, or maybe just missing the point entirely.
That's really interesting because you so often hear those verses cited as proof that the Bible itself was altered or changed.
Right, but it seems like the Quran might actually be critiquing something totally different.
Yeah, so what is that distinction?
It's like the Quran is calling out instances where people are distorting the meaning of the scriptures.
Okay.
Twisting verses to fit their agendas, or even just flat out teaching things that go against what's actually written in the texts.
So it's not about the text itself changing. No, it's more about people potentially messing with the message.
Exactly. And that difference between the divine word and human interpretation, that's at the very heart of how the Quran handles this whole topic.
That's really interesting. It really challenges this common narrative that's out there, that the Quran is just, against the Bible.
Yeah, it's definitely more complex than that.
It seems like it's way more complex and, honestly, a lot more respectful of the Bible than a lot of people might realize.
It really is. And it just goes to show that assumptions can lead you astray.
For sure.
It's important to go straight to the source material because you often find a much more nuanced and, frankly, more interesting perspective.
Which is what we try to do on this show.
Exactly.
So speaking of nuance, the Quran also talks about the power of God to protect his word, which adds another layer to all this.
Oh, absolutely.
So if the Quran emphasizes that God's word is unchangeable, how does that apply to these earlier scriptures?
Well, let me tell you, the Quran makes a pretty bold claim.
Okay, well, hit me with it.
It's not just once, it's all over the place. It repeatedly emphasizes that the words of God are fixed, they don't change, and they're totally protected from any alteration.
Wow.
It's not just saying it's a fact, it's like, this is a testament to God's power, a reassurance to believers.
So it's more than just, passing down words accurately.
Oh.
It's about this divine ability to keep the message pure.
You got it. And there's even one verse that calls the preservation of God's words a great attainment. Like, it's this monumental victory.
It really makes you wonder, though, if the Quran is so clear about God's power to protect his word, wouldn't that protection have applied to earlier scriptures too?
That right there is a question that has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries, and it's a big one too.
Yeah.
Because if we accept that God can perfectly preserve his word, it forces us to ask, where did these accusations of distortion and corruption even come from? Who are we to question that preservation?
So if the problem isn't that the scriptures themselves have been changed or corrupted, then what? Like, where does that leave us?
It seems like we're pointing at human interpretation, at the potential for us to get things wrong. You know?
Right, because we're not perfect.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this is something that a lot of early Islamic scholars really grappled with.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They asked these tough questions about how people were living out their faith compared to what their scriptures said they should be doing.
Okay, I like where this is going.
For example, they noticed that while the Torah and the Quran both say Saturday is the Sabbath, a lot of people who called themselves Christian were observing Sunday as their day of rest.
That is interesting.
So they saw this as a potential discrepancy between what the scripture said and how people were actually practicing their faith.
That's a really great example. It highlights how the Quran isn't shying away from those inconsistencies, how what's written isn't always matching up with how people are living.
It's about accountability, in a way.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier. It's not about saying the Bible is wrong, but rather, why isn't this adding up?
Yes, exactly. You see this pattern throughout the Quran, this focus on calling out potential misinterpretations, this emphasis on the responsibility to accurately represent the messages within these scriptures.
It's like a reminder that faith isn't just about blindly following. It's about engaging with the text, wrestling with it even.
And acknowledging that even with sacred texts, we have to consider that human element, that potential for things to get lost in translation, you know?
Absolutely. Especially with texts that have had such a huge impact as the Bible and the Quran. But, this actually leads me to a question I've been thinking about.
Sure.
If the Quran is so clear about the importance of believing in these scriptures that came before it, why is there so much suspicion around the Bible in some Muslim communities today?
That is a fantastic question and a really important one.
Like, what happened? Where did that disconnect come from?
It's a long and complicated story, honestly. There's a lot to unpack there about how interpretations have evolved over time and maybe even a lack of direct engagement with these texts in some cases.
So maybe some assumptions crept in.
Perhaps.
It seems like somewhere along the way, there was this disconnect between what the Quran itself actually says and how it's being understood or even taught by some.
It's true. And that actually reminds me of this really fascinating piece of advice that's given in the Quran, not just to Muslims in general, but to the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Oh, okay, now you've got me curious. What kind of advice are we talking about here?
So the Quran actually tells the Prophet Muhammad, like, if he's ever having doubts about his own revelations, he should go and consult with those who are already reading the scriptures.
You mean like people of the Jewish and Christian faiths?
Exactly. It's wild, right?
That's amazing. It's like the Quran is saying, don't just take my word for it. Go check it out yourself.
Right. It's all about seeking knowledge from different places, encouraging actual dialogue between people, even if they have different beliefs.
It really makes you think, like, how different would things be if we still approach these topics with that mindset?
Totally.
But going back to what you were saying about those early Islamic scholars, it sounds like they were really grappling with this, trying to reconcile their beliefs with these discrepancies they were seeing.
Yeah, for sure. And for centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, you had these big names, these prominent scholars like Ibn Abbas, al-Tabari, even Ibn Taymiyyah, and he was a pretty influential figure. They all agreed that the Bible itself hadn't actually been corrupted.
Hold on, seriously. Those are some major figures in Islamic scholarship. So they weren't on board with this idea that the Bible had been changed.
Nope, not at all. When they looked at the Quran's critiques, they didn't see it as being about the text of the Bible itself. They saw it as being about how some people, some individuals or groups, were twisting the teachings, misrepresenting them.
So it was more about people's actions than the scriptures themselves.
100%. They were much more concerned with calling out hypocrisy, with pointing out when what people were doing didn't match up with what the scriptures actually said.
That is a really important distinction. It's like they were saying, hey, you're not even following your own book.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that this whole idea of the Bible's text being corrupted, it seems like that gained a lot more traction much later on, historically speaking.
So this wasn't always the dominant view. That changes things.
Yeah. Right. It challenges this narrative that Islam has always viewed the Bible as being corrupted. It's just not true.
So how do we make sense of that? What shifted?
Well, it's complicated, and there's probably not one single answer.
Okay.
But it highlights how important it is to look at these interpretations within their historical context. What was happening at the time? What were the influences that might have shaped these views? We can't just take things at face value.
It's like anything else, context is key. It's not enough to just look at what's being said. We have to think about when, where, and why it's being said.
Exactly. And when we do that with the Qur'an's perspective on the Bible, it becomes clear that the conversation is way more nuanced, way more multi-layered than a lot of people might initially think.
It's true. It's like we're uncovering this whole hidden history of interfaith dialogue that was happening back then, where seeking common ground and trying to understand each other was valued.
And that actually brings us to another really interesting point about the Quran.
What's that?
It doesn't just tell Muslims to, passively believe in these earlier scriptures.
Yeah.
It actually encourages them to go out and learn from people of other faiths.
Oh, right. It even tells the Prophet Muhammad to do that, right?
Exactly. It's like, if you're unsure about something, go ask someone who's been reading these scriptures their whole life. It's remarkable.
It really is. It sounds like the Quran is advocating for this much more open-minded, engaged approach to interfaith relations even today.
100%. It's a message that feels so incredibly relevant to the world we're living in right now,
Absolutely. So if that's the case, why do you think this idea that the Bible has been corrupted? Why has that taken such a strong hold?
That is the million-dollar question. And honestly, I don't think there's one simple answer.
Okay, well, humor me. What are some of the factors that you think might be at play?
Well, one possibility is that as time went on and as different communities became more, insular, there was just less direct contact with people of other faiths.
So less interaction, less dialogue.
Exactly. And when that happens, it's easier for misunderstandings to creep in, maybe even some mistrust.
And we start to fill in the blanks with our assumptions.
Right. And then we have to factor in historical events, power dynamics, all of that.
Because those things always influence how we interpret things, especially religious texts.
For sure. Conflicts and tensions, they leave their mark. So it's important to remember our understanding of these texts doesn't exist in a vacuum, It's shaped by our lived experiences, our communities, even our fears, unfortunately.
That's so true. It's so easy to fall into that trap of reading these texts through the lens of our own biases.
It is. But the Quran, it seems to be urging us to do the opposite,
To be more open-minded.
Yeah, to approach these texts, even the ones that are different from our own traditions, with a genuine curiosity, a willingness to understand.
To really listen to what they have to say, even if it challenges us.
Exactly. And that is a powerful message, a really powerful message.
It makes you wonder what would happen if we actually lived that out, If we engaged in those respectful dialogues, not just about the Quran and the Bible, but about all religious texts.
Wouldn't that be something?
Imagine the insights we might uncover if we're willing to let go of our preconceived notions and really listen.
It's an exciting thought, for sure.
It really is. It's like rediscovering that spirit of curiosity and open-mindedness that seems to have been so central to early Islamic thought.
Absolutely. It's a challenge worth taking on.
100%. And it's bigger than just the Quran and the Bible. It's about how we approach all sacred texts, all traditions.
Because at the end of the day, these texts have survived for a reason.
They speak to something deeper.
They contain these profound truths that have resonated with people across time and cultures, and they continue to offer guidance and inspiration today.
To those who are willing to listen.
Exactly. So let's not shy away from asking the tough questions.
Let's keep exploring, keep learning.
And let's remember to approach these texts and each other with a genuine desire to understand.
Because it's in those moments of authentic connection that we deepen our understanding, not just of these texts, but of ourselves and the world around us.
And who knows what amazing discoveries we might make along the way.
That's the beauty of it all, right? The journey is the reward.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think we've done some serious deep diving today. We've explored the Quran's perspective on the Bible, challenged some common assumptions, and hopefully sparked some new insights for our listeners.
It's been a pleasure diving into these topics with you.
Likewise. And to everyone listening, we encourage you to continue this exploration on your own. Pick up these texts, don't be afraid to ask questions, and engage in those respectful dialogues.
You never know what you might find.
Until next time, keep diving deep. It's like we're being challenged to really step outside of our comfort zones here,
Yeah, for sure.
to engage with the unfamiliar
To embrace the unknown.
and see where it leads.
Exactly.
It's like we're being asked to move beyond just inheriting our beliefs, and to actually wrestle with these texts,
Right, get your hands dirty.
grapple with them, let them challenge us.
Let yourself be transformed by them.
Yes. And I think that's where the real value of a deep dive like this comes in, right?
Totally.
It's not about, checking boxes or proving one side right or wrong.
No, not at all.
It's about the exploration.
It's a journey.
The questions.
Being okay with not knowing all the answers.
And just being willing to open our minds and see these texts, these traditions, in a new light.
And maybe even each other?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even texts that are this old, they still have something to say to us today.
Oh, absolutely.
They can challenge our assumptions, make us rethink things.
They can turn your whole world upside down. In a good way, hopefully.
Right, in a way that makes us grow.
Exactly. And you know what else? Sometimes when we step outside of our comfort zones like that, when we move past our own little echo chambers,
Yeah.
we might even find some common ground where we least expect it.
Oh, man, that is powerful. It's like, yeah, we might have our differences, but there's often so much more that connects us.
So much.
And maybe, just maybe, engaging with these texts with that openness, that
It's
curiosity,
that willingness to listen.
it can help us bridge those divides.
Build bridges instead of walls.
Yes, 100%.
So what do you say? Are you up for the challenge?
I'm always up for a challenge. And I think it's a challenge that goes way beyond just the Quran and the Bible.
It's a lifelong journey, really.
It's about how we approach all religious texts, all those traditions that have been passed down.
With humility.
Yeah, with a willingness to learn and grow.
And maybe be a little bit wrong along the way.
Exactly. Because who knows? If we can do that, if we can approach these texts with open hearts and minds, we might just find ourselves surprised by what we discover.
Oh, I guarantee you will be surprised. There's so much wisdom there, so much insight, just waiting to be uncovered.
It's like these texts have stood the test of time for a reason.
They've got something to say.
They offer something that we still need today.
Guidance, inspiration,
Hope, even.
all of that. It's all there for those who are willing to do the work.
To dive deep. Well, on that note, I'd say we've done our fair share of diving today. We explored the Quran's perspective on the Bible, challenged some assumptions, and hopefully got some interesting conversations started.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
The pleasure's all mine. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll keep those conversations going, keep asking those tough questions, keep searching for those deeper truths. Until next time, keep diving deep.